Hey, welcome to the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. This is lesson 36, team analysis part 2. Please watch part 1. It would be a lot better for you to get through into this lesson. This is going to be kind of only 7 slides. I don't know how long it's going to take for me to talk about them, but it was a key block of information here as we move through. Just to let you know, I think I got 11 parts to this block of material, team analysis here. So again, the whole purpose and what I'm trying to do is outline my process I do every year. So you're kind of looking over my shoulder. I'm videoing it, showing you the actual data that I've generated. And this helps me win, puts money in my pocket. Maybe it will help you as well. It's a lot of material. It's the first year, too. You're going to have to put some time and effort in. You got to chop the wood, then you can get some fire. And those that have wanted the fire without chopping the wood or probably didn't even pay attention to this or have gone long since. So we're talking to the hardcore now, the folks who want to be different. It's going to put you in a different mindset and put you in a different way to analyze data and approach this game that I think we all love. So there are some nice low-hanging fruit at the end of this journey here. Plenty of wood to chop for big fire. At least we hope so, right? Okay, so team analysis. The big question for me was, can we look back last year at teams and their total fantasy point averages and kind of use that as a guide, as a reference class forecast for the next season? So looking at 2020, thinking about 2021. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. Certainly, if we could use that, and if there is some underpinnings to this approach, then you kind of have a good tiebreaker if everything else is equal. Knowing whether the team was good or poor last year probably is a good place to break some ties in your drafts. What we see here is called a box and whisker, which is it's not really a statistical way. It's kind of a way to visualize the data, and it allows you to get a snapshot of said data. And this is from 2014 to 2020. This is team fantasy point average distributions, and it's by year. So this is 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and this is 2020 right here. So I did some colorization here. So what is this saying? Well, first, the X is the average of the 32 teams that year. Okay, so the averages, for the most part, are kind of in this range here. If you look at this, I'm about, what is this, 70 something to about 90 something, kind of the average, kind of at this point. The next point is at the end of the box. So this is in the box and whisker, this is the box. And the idea is that about 66% of our data will exist or did exist in that box. So the broader the box is, the deeper the more spread out the data was. And the shorter the box is, the less spread out. And you can see that, for instance, 2014 was the most spread out teams were as far as their fantasy point averages in that last, was it 7 years? So that's kind of interesting. Most of the teams were kind of in a little bit narrower range. And you can look at the boxes here. Notice 14, 15, 16, 17 here. 17, the box is actually slipped down. That was a really poor year for production. That means that most teams did not produce a lot of fantasy point average or fantasy points versus the years before and after. So just 2017 was a piss poor year for team fantasy point, which is something interesting. So even better than the COVID year in 2020. This line is the median. This is half the data is on either side of that line. So there is some variation there. And the whiskers are these points here. The whiskers are 98% of the data fall between the whiskers. So only the 2%, the extreme 1% here and here would be above the whiskers. So you get an idea of the extreme nature of the situation. And so 2014 is very extreme. And even the COVID year wasn't as extreme as the year before. Here's the whiskers for 2019. Okay, so it just kind of gives us a visual tool of the data and probably tells you that there is some type of internal consistency. There are limits to what teams do as far as fantasy point productions, with the exception of 2017. You have to understand that data means something, okay, and it's not just random. If it were random, then these boxes and whiskers would be all over the place, whereas they're not so much. They're a lot more alike than different in a lot of ways. So just kind of a snapshot of the last few years here. And so people might think that the COVID year was somehow skewed or different, but if you look at the level of team fantasy point averages, it really wasn't that amazing of a year. It was kind of like a 2016 in some ways, pretty close to the others. 2014 had the highest average right here. The X is above all rest. And looks like 2017 had the lowest. So that was kind of the extremes in the last 7 years. So if you look at last year's rankings and you took that team and figured out what they did the preceding year. So I looked at 2014 to 2020. So that means I started in 2013 to do the 2014. I gathered the data, and so you can break it into eighths, so into 4 quadrants. So the top 8, the next 8, the next 8, and the bottom 8 were shown here. And if we look across the 7 years, here's the average of the fantasy point average. So it's a grand average. And here is 86.5 from the top slice versus 74.7 on the bottom slice. So what is that, 12-point difference? It's not a great amount, but it is a difference there, and that can, be something significant, okay? And then I also have variation, and notice the highest variation is in the top slice, And the next eighths was the lowest variation, which was kind of surprising. You might have predicted the worst teams would have the highest variation, second highest, but not shoot. So if you're kind of a crappy team, you're kind of a crappy team. Uh, so if we look at the graph, just another way to see the data. I graph the fantasy point averages here in the boxes going down, okay, and then the variation, and we see that the extremes have the highest variation, which is may not be so much of a surprise, but there will be variation in the fantasy points. So the top 8, I'm not sure you should order them like, okay, first is better than 8th. I think this variation is telling you that it's slippery on that. Just kind of think of it as in quarters, quadrants, I guess. So here's the actual data just to show how what data I did generate going across the years there. So then I had 4 groups of data, four quadrants. And if we look at the box and whisker that way, okay, now this is different than, this is the total data across all the 7 years. And we look at the top 8 here versus the bottom 8 there. We see that the whiskers come up to 117 and 54, and the extreme low is the whiskers 111 to 50. So it is lower, okay, and it kind of shows a trend. And we can use statistical analysis to answer, is the average 86, basically 86 and a half, 82, 77, and 74. Does that really mean something to us, or is this all random? And this, over these 7 years, and these actual box and whiskers have nothing to do, and it's not real. It's all random by chance. So we have statistical ways to address that, which is always nice. And so the first thing we do is we look at the data set, and I showed you the 4 quadrants. And here is the team status. The quadrant, the top 8, 9 to 16, 17 through 24th, and the bottom 8. So the software I use groups them into letters. Just, you have to understand what group A, B, C, and D. So this is kind of a code. And we did an analysis of variance, and there's a lot of data for us to look at. But the bottom line is the probability that there is a difference within these groups. So the ANOVA looks at all the different groups and compares them to each other and gathers statistical inferences from those comparisons and tells us basically there is at least one difference or there isn't. If there isn't, then it's all random, okay? And the p-value would be fairly high. This is 6.4 times 10 to the minus fifth, so very small amount of probability that the differences we see is random. So that means basically you can reject that they actually are the same even though they're not, right? And so the one or more of the treatments, and so again, these treatments are just how we separated the data here, group A, B, C, and D. The treatments are different. So now, once we said there's at least one difference, we can use another statistical test. I use the Tukey test, highest significance difference test, as a way to compare all these groups to each other and say, are they different or are they not? Very simple. And so what we see is this. Here is the Tukey HSD, and we'll be looking at the top 8 versus the next group, Group B, the next 8 down. So the top 16, you should consider them to be the same. So that pretty much says that quadrants probably are not, as far as the top quadrant, is all the same. So the top 16 teams can be considered the same as far as this analysis here. But the top 8 is better than the bottom 8 or the very bottom. C and D there. Pardon me. And we look at the next 8 versus C is insignificant, but the bottom, it is very significant. And the Faronian-Holmes test just looks at the top slice, A versus BC. It's just another way to look at it. And we can pretty much say that the top 8 are going to be different this year versus last year's bottom 16. Okay, so we can believe that data here. 86.5 is different than these numbers, and it's real. Okay, so we're talking 10 to 14% difference on average in each team. So there's going to be players that as a group are going to be scoring more points for last year's top 8 versus last year's 17th through 32nd. So that gives us a little bit of a nice tiebreaker, and we should consider that some valuable data. I would probably be safe and say the top 8 versus the bottom 8 is really where I'm going to try to break some ties there. But this is what the stats say, and confirms that these actual averages are significantly different. And this is really, I know it may not, if you're not into stats, it may not seem like a big deal, but this is, anytime you could get with as few samples as we have in fantasy football, actual statistically significant data, it's a victory. And that's, and of course, if you pay attention on Twitter, I don't see this stuff. Do you see this stuff? No, they don't. They'd rather flap their chops about anything but stats. Okay, everybody claims to be stats, but where's the actual testing? Okay, where's our limits? This is something we can hang our hat on, and it's really satisfying to me to have that in the back of my head as I go through. So definitely before I go into drafts, I'm going to make sure I kind of commit to memory the top 8 versus the bottom 8. Yeah. And you're saying, well, how do you use that? I use it as a tiebreaker. So the wide receiver 1 from a top 18 versus a bottom 8, if that's my choice, I'm going with the top team. Okay. So does that mean my wide receiver 2 from last year's top 8 is better than the wide receiver 1 from the bottom 8? I don't know about that. Okay, I'm not sure we can, it might be, might not. Okay, there's other ways to test, other measuring sticks to use. But it's certainly a good tiebreaker, and it's something people in your league will not have. They'll be looking at funny names or their favorite team or whatever, just randomly grabbing somebody because they've had too many beers, which is good, If it's a high stakes league, I'd buy the beer, right? Here, gentlemen, drink up. And here's a 5th. Got to be high stakes, make it worth my while to ply everybody with alcohol. Anyway, it excites me. I know when the stats actually I can show that we can statistically believe what the data that I've generated. That's a victory. Okay, that's better than picking the top player each year. Okay, this makes me extremely happy. So I'm such a metric data nerd. Okay, come back. We got lots more to talk about. Lots of good stuff here. We are just building the kindling. We're going to have a hell of a fire time you've done with all my lessons. By the way, I'm shooting for about 100 to be done by maybe the end of July. So come August, you should be barrels loaded, ready to crush your opponents. And that's what we're trying to do for you here. Okay, come back. This is the process. My name is Dr. John Bush, Mr. Stats here. As a joke. Okay, bye.